Welcome back, everyone, to part two of our look at the Irish potato famine. I hope you guys enjoyed part one. It seems like you did. Seems to be a pretty popular video. If you did not see part one, there's a link in the description that'll take you back to the beginning, so you can see that and get caught up. We are using Extra Histories series on the Irish potato famine as our discussion starter, and the discussion's been great so far. I threw a question out yesterday. I talked about how a lot of Americans, we use the term Scots-Irish to talk about descendants or of ancestors that we have who came from Northern Ireland, that part of Ireland that was settled by Scottish people a few generations earlier, who then came from Ireland to the United States, and we call them Scots-Irish here. And I posed the question, is that what they're called over there? And many of you responded and said no. Typically in the UK, in Ireland, they're known as Ulster Scots. So thank you for that. I learned something new from you, as I often do. Looking at a map here, there are 4 historic provinces in Ireland. Ireland has counties, as you can see the counties here in Ulster province. And those 4 historic provinces are Munster, Leinster, Connacht, and Ulster. Ulster being the northernmost one. Most of what makes up the historic Ulster province is Northern Ireland today, with the exception of 3 counties. I believe they're Monaghan, Cavan, and Donegal. And I apologize if I mispronounce any of these things. You guys can let me know how I'm getting them wrong. I hope to go to Ireland in the next couple of years. Very excited about visiting that place at some point. But so most of that region today is Northern Ireland, but they call them Ulster Scots. So thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and dive right into part 2. I'll put the link in the description to the original content if you want to watch it over on Extra History without my commentary. Here we go.
London, September 12th, 1845. The press operator runs off issues of the Gardener's Chronicle. Over 6,000 copies, fresh and ready for tomorrow. The editor bursts in, waving a piece of paper. They must stop the presses and insert a front page notice. No, it can't wait until next week. The potato blight has reached Ireland, the notice reads. Crops around Dublin are perishing. It ends with a question. Where will Ireland be in the event of a universal potato rot? So
it said, we can't wait till next week. A lot of newspapers at the time, and this is true in multiple countries, didn't run every single day. There were very few that did, mostly in the big cities where they had a huge circulation. But in smaller towns, smaller villages, places like that, you're going to see a couple times a week, maybe once a week, and that's probably the case here.
But everyone knows where it will be, in the embrace of hunger. 2 months later, the Gardener's Chronicle was in the minority when it predicted agricultural disaster. Over the past 2 months, the press sent mixed signals. Some said the potato crop was fine. Others that the blight only affected a few counties. So to get a sense of the problem, Prime Minister Robert Peel sent a scientific commission to get solid numbers. Wait, pause the history for just a second. The Prime Minister's name during the potato famine was Peel. No one else thinks that's a little funny? No, I know it's a serious story. Come on, stop looking at me like, fine, you know what, it's fine, it's fine. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. His name's Peel, though. Now, that commission was in the House of Commons, telling Parliament to expect 80% mortality in the potato crop. They'd devised methods for keeping the blight away from harvested potatoes, but these proved ineffective.
So it's important to recognize what's happening here. This is very early on. This is when it's first starting. And already at the top of the government, they're aware. They know there's a problem. They know what they're facing. They're in a position to be on top of it, to deal with it, to help the people who are going to be affected by it. There's an opportunity right here. These are those crossroads moments, right, where you can look back in history and you can see the moment when history diverges because a decision is made or not made, or an action is taken or is not taken. And you can see in this moment right now, if they act, a lot of people don't have to die.
The news troubled Peel. In the summer, there had been hints of crop loss, but that was nothing new. Irish potatoes were unreliable. There'd been 16 potato failures since 1800, and when crops failed, tenants couldn't pay their rent. When tenants didn't pay, landlords brought police and troops to throw them off their land. That meant riots and retaliatory livestock killings. It would also mean secret societies like the Molly Maguires and White Boys ambushing landlords and middlemen in their carriages. And those previous potato losses were only regional.
So let's take a minute and kind of go back to something he talked about there. So the Molly Maguires have their roots in Ireland, but a lot of that transferred to the United States to where in the post-Civil War era, you have Molly Maguires being a real problem to the point where you have, like the Pinkerton Agency, for example, putting agents, secret agents on the inside of the Molly Maguires to kind of deal with them. You could almost think of this like an organized crime thing, though it's not nearly the same. But you can see here, after a series of often violent conflicts, 20 suspected members of the Molly Maguires were convicted of murder and other crimes and executed by hanging in 1877 and 1878. A lot of that is in Pennsylvania, but their roots are in Ireland. Northeastern Pennsylvania, this is coal country, big time. This is an area where you had a lot of Irish and Welsh immigrants who ended up in, when you have things like the Panic of 1873, which was a major financial crisis where like a huge percentage of the American population was out of work for a while, especially in factories. This led to showdowns between unions and the Molly Maguires, and so that's one of those things, kind of like the Sicilian mob in Sicily and Italy that comes over with immigrants. The Molly Maguires get brought over to the United States as well. I wasn't familiar with their story too much in Ireland, but I am familiar with their story here in the United States a generation later.
This was the whole island. Instability worried Peel. A few years before, the Irish Member of Parliament, Daniel O'Connell, who had campaigned successfully against anti-Catholic laws, had set his sights on repealing the Act of Union. O'Connell's outdoor meetings had attracted 500,000 people. And
so you have a lot of the roots here of the independence movement that'll come to a head during the First World War and in the years after, to where in the early 1920s, Ireland, they create the Irish Free State. Ireland does get its independence. And you see a lot of that going on here, and you can start to see the political kind of aspect to this, where if you're the British leadership and you see that the Irish are doing this, you have an opportunity to maybe squelch any ideas of rebellion or independence. It's unfortunate that it came at the cost of innocent lives.
And the government had to threaten force to disperse them. Since then, Peel had taken a more conciliatory approach, but famine could upend everything. And the reports were bad. Now that it was November and the full harvests were coming in, the scope of the problem was becoming clear. Not even harvested potatoes were safe. In Western Ireland, a poor farmer had buried his harvested potatoes in a pit, muttering a prayer at how lucky he'd been. No blight. But a few days later, he opened the pit to check them. Half were totally rotten. Panic struck the whole west of Ireland, where the climate was too wet for grain or oats. I cannot describe in language strong enough, read one account, the frightful and awful alarm of the poor people. May God, in his bountiful mercy, avert such a disastrous calamity. Peel had his faults, but inaction was not one of them. The son of a tech...
Was one of his faults putting ketchup on eggs?
Peel had his faults.
And something else that's kind of interesting, totally unrelated to all of this, but if you ever see the movie The Martian with Matt Damon, which is fantastic, by the way, it's a really, really good movie. Potatoes play a big role in that, and the fact that they're so easy to grow and multiply, and a lot of why potatoes were so important a crop to the Irish are a lot of the same reasons why they play such an important role in that movie.
But inaction was not one of them. The son of a textile industrialist, he was the first prime minister to come from business rather than the aristocracy. He'd risen through the civil service with sheer hard work and a few big gambles. And he was about to gamble again. Ireland would need food, but Peel would have to walk a fine line. He was a Tory, and his Conservative Party were hardcore trade protectionists, particularly due to support from grain merchants.
The Tories are the same party who primarily were in favor of prosecuting the war against the colonies during the American Revolution. That's why American loyalists were often called Tories, because they were people who stayed loyal to the crown. They were considered to be aligning themselves with the Tories or the Conservative Party in England.
Whatever he did, it couldn't undercut or upset the grain market. And then there was the opposition, the Liberal Wigs. They were similarly hardcore when it came to free trade economics. They hated any government intervention in the market. So in other words, the Tories wouldn't support bringing in foreign grain because it would cut local merchants' profits, and the Whigs would shoot down any intervention on price.
So, pretty common thing at this time in history is something called laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire basically, I think in French means like just leave it alone. In other words, don't interfere. The government doesn't regulate, doesn't do things, just kind of let everything run its course. And this is one of those times where the government really needs to intervene, but they don't because of laissez-faire policies.
Meanwhile, Daniel O'Connell and a Dublin group proposed their own measures. Forbid turning grain into whiskey, bring in foreign grains, institute public works, and stop exporting Irish grain, beef, and oats to England. Neither party, Peel knew, would stand for that. After all, grain imports were already a sensitive split, as the two parties consistently brawled over the Corn Laws, a series of protectionist measures meant to keep cheap American grain out of the UK. Oh, by the way, in Britain, corn means grain. Got it? Cool. Peel had a plan to thread the needle, but it had...
Why is it cheap coming from America? Well, look, again, we talked about this in the last episode. Look at how much land there is in the United States, how much farmland there is. The amount of space for farming is very limited in Britain. Now, as we talked about last episode, the advancements in technology in terms of farming that happened during the 18th century and into the 19th century help a lot, and they multiply the value of farmland because they can produce a lot more on smaller areas. But the United States just has massive amounts of places that they can grow, and so they're exporting a lot of food to places like Britain.
Had to stay a secret. He sent an agent to Boston on a mission to buy 100,000 pounds worth of maize or cornmeal. Peel's agents then started shipping it to Ireland on the quiet. His bet was this: since maize didn't grow in Britain and no British merchants traded in it, this wouldn't be a direct intervention in the market. But the shipments still had to be kept secret, or British merchants might freak out about the competition and withhold their shipments to Ireland.
Think about all of this is over money. It's over trade. Nobody's talking about the human toll here. What's going to happen if this doesn't happen? So while we're all fighting over money and imports and trade, people are going to start dying.
The plan wasn't to feed Ireland with cornmeal. It was that cheap cornmeal would keep food prices low. Maize would not be given away, but sold at cost to counties, and paid for by landlords who would fundraise through their own poor relief organizations. The government would then match those funds and deliver the cornmeal from regional food depots. Peel also instituted road building projects where people could earn a wage to buy the cornmeal.
So you can kind of sense already what's going to happen here because you got all these middlemen. It's probably not going to filter down to the people it needs to get to. This happens a lot even today. People often talk about, well, how come there's been so much famine and starvation in places in Africa, for example? And a lot of it was the same issues. You know, back in the 80s, there was a huge push to try and deal with a lot of these famines and hunger and starvation and things like that. But what was happening was the food was getting there, but it wasn't getting to the people because it was getting intercepted by warlords and people like that. I don't know how much that still goes on, but I'm sure it's still a thing. These aren't warlords, but you can kind of sense where this is going.
It would be revenue neutral. Ireland, he said, must feed Ireland. If that sounds like a convoluted bureaucratic nightmare to you, you are correct. The idea of fundraising was a particularly terrible one. It meant that the poorest counties got less food aid than the richer ones. Parish priests complained that no one in their county had anything to donate. If they could, they would have already bought food. Irish farmers ended up pawning their few possessions to buy cornmeal. Others had no choice but to sign up for the hard labor of working on the roads. There were logistical hurdles too. Irish infrastructure was dismal, with a minuscule railway network and roads that deteriorated outside major cities. Maize shipments had to navigate those rocky networks to reach rural areas. But even before that, the maize had to be ground into cornmeal, and Ireland only had 2 mills that could accomplish that. And even when people got the cornmeal, they had to learn to cook it properly or else it made them sick. Scurvy, previously unknown due to the potato's high vitamin C content, started cropping up.
So, you don't think of potatoes having a lot of vitamin C, but vitamin C comes from a lot of these fruits and vegetables that we get, mostly fruits. But scurvy is going to cause you to start bleeding from your gums. It's going to cause all kinds of problems. It was something sailors dealt a lot with during this time and earlier. And these people aren't thinking about what is the nutritional content of my potato. We got to remember it's a very different world than it is today. We watch this stuff, and all I think is, man, how lucky we are. Our biggest complaint is, oh man, we're not getting chips in to be able to get vehicles manufactured in time. My wife and I just got a new van. We ordered it in September. We got it 2 weeks ago, and that's like our biggest complaint in life. These people had to figure out whether or not they were going to be alive next week, and they didn't know the first thing about the nutritional value of cornmeal versus potatoes. And when they started getting sick, they probably didn't even necessarily know why.
So people who couldn't get the relief food went hungry, and people who could plunged deeper into poverty, keeping themselves fed. Some even subsisted on spoiled potatoes. There were food riots and a few high-profile attacks on wealthy citizens. In one county, 1,500 Irish farmers turned up, all armed, when a group of British troops arrived to enforce an eviction. But overall, there was no major risings, and no mass death. People survived. Peel, however, would not, because his maize and work programs were not the end of his plans. Though a Tory, he'd come around to the free trade views of the Liberal Wigs. He disliked the Corn Laws, which kept cheap American grain off the British market, artificially inflating bread prices, and saw in the Irish crisis an opportunity to push for repeal. Now, if it helped Ireland, so much the better. But that...
Not the priority, but if it helps, hey, why not? Always looking for the agenda, always looking for how can I use this, and nothing is different today. Politicians still do this. How can I spin this crisis to help my side?
That was secondary. He would use this famine as a cudgel to beat his opponents with. He took on the Corn Laws, decrying how high tariffs contributed to starvation in Ireland. And he argued that greed, as much as blight, was starving the Irish farmer. And this was explosive. In 1845, the Corn Laws conjured up the same emotional weight that surrounds issues like healthcare and fuel taxes today. Champions of the law predicted that repeal would collapse the agricultural sector, while the repeal camp cast images of a starving British public unable to afford bread.
So yeah, think of whatever your political issues are in the past 20, 30 years that people have spun to be the worst thing ever. The opponents of an issue are going to tell you the gloom and doom. Oh my gosh, this will be the end of society as we know it. This is what will happen. It'll be a disaster. The proponents of it are going to spin it like it's the best thing that will ever happen in the history of anything. They're both wrong, but that's what people do to try and get people to their side, and they're doing the same thing with this issue here.
This move pushed Peel out as Prime Minister, but he was back 2 weeks later when the opposition failed to form a government. Long term, repealing the Corn Laws would prove good for Britain. Cheap food.
I should pause there for American audience and people who don't understand parliamentary systems. Forming a government, if no political party or group has a majority in Parliament, then they can't form a government. In other words, you have to have a coalition with another party. Let's say there's 6 different parties, and your party might have the most, but maybe you only have 40% of the members of Parliament. You need to put together a coalition with some other groups to get you over that 50% so that you've got enough to form a government and then have your leader be the Prime Minister. And because the opposition who tossed him out couldn't form a government, he came back.
Food helped fuel the expansion of its industrial base and build its empire, but it did nothing to help Ireland. In fact, by tying famine relief to the Corn Laws, he'd thrown the Irish poor into a partisan crossfire. Now, members of the pro-Corn Law camp doubted there even was a famine in Ireland. They spun conspiracy theories that Peel had embellished reports of blight in order to galvanize the repeal effort. And this theory gained credence when news emerged that the Scientific Commission had overestimated the 1845 crop loss.
Now, this is a time in history where you don't have 24-hour news channels, you don't have instant news, you don't have people on the ground that can tell you exactly what's happening. You're getting your news sometimes weeks later, and only filtered in through newspaper people with an agenda, politicians with an agenda. So even though today we feel like that still happens, where what do we believe? Do we know it's really true? It was that much more of an issue then. So now they're spinning that this isn't even happening. There's no famine. There's no blight. There's no concern in Ireland. This is all being spun for political reasons, which it was, but it didn't make it less true.
They had predicted an 80% mortality for the potato, but actually, the figure ended up being about half that. It was still a dire situation, sure, but not the agricultural apocalypse the scientists had sold Parliament. This ugly partisan warfare meant two things. First, an entrenched bloc in Parliament now saw famine relief as a partisan issue, tied to the Corn Laws. And second, it created an impression that reports of crop loss in Ireland were always exaggerated. But the truth boiled down to this. In the future, families would die with empty bellies in Ireland, while in London, politicians would dismiss reports of famine as alarmist. Peel won in the end. On June 29, 1846, as his cornmeal deliveries were finally in full swing, he crossed the aisle and voted with the opposition, repealing the Corn Laws once and for all. But he got to enjoy his victory for less than 24 hours, because the next day, both parties revolted and threw him out of power.
So he goes to the other side, he gets what he wants, but then nobody wants him.
The Whigs took over, high on their victory. And Peel's relief program, which had let the Irish poor barely scrape by through the first year of the crisis, came under the full control of a civil servant named Sir Charles Trevalion. His first act was to cancel the food shipments. After all, the task was done. Next year's crop was about to come in. But the 1846 crop was a total failure. And the bad times, the great hunger, were about to begin.
But you've already set the stage for people to, number one, not believe it's real, and number two, believe it's all about politics. And so even though something might be in their best interest, if it goes against what their party's stance is, they're going to oppose it. And so, yes, you can see all the parallels even today in a lot of this stuff. People will often oppose what's in their own best interest if it's what they've been told is the other party's idea. A lot of times people don't even support good ideas because they came from the wrong people, or they just refuse to believe anything that comes out of that side. So that's always been a thing, and unfortunately in this situation, it's going to lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we will see you again tomorrow. Going to be doing a 250,000 subs live stream celebration on Sunday. I'll let you know the time, hopefully in tomorrow's episode. I'm also going to be doing a live stream on my gaming channel at 2 p.m. Eastern time on Saturday, because there's a new Civil War game that I'm going to be playing as part of a live event for. So I'm excited about that. So if you want to check that out, the link is in the description to my gaming channel. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.